Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 5th Orientation and Training webinar for the 2013 class of District Superintendents and Directors of Connectional Ministries. The topic for today's webinar is appointment making before, during, and after. How do you prepare for them? How to make the introduction of pastors to congregations, and what you need to do to follow up after the appointments are fixed. In the next hour, we will use that three-part outline for our time together. And again today, I'm very pleased to say that Bishop Steiner Ball is with us today. So welcome to you, Bishop.
Hello. It's good to be with you again.
Good to have you along for the ride. And as we launch into our topic for today, we are reminded that the appointment-making process is one of the 7 strategic points of supervision that we reviewed at Lake Junaluska in the ongoing work of the district superintendent. And in emphasizing the strategic nature of appointment making, we're also reminded of the district superintendent's role as chief missional strategist. And your work in the appointment making process is the strategic point for deploying pastors in pursuit of your conferences or your district's missional priorities. So as we go through today's webinar and time together, we hope that we want to encourage you to encourage a conversation with your bishop and your colleagues about your conferences and your district's missional priorities and how those priorities will shape the collaborative work of the appointment-making process and the priorities and processes that you set there. We hope that this conversation will be helpful to all of you, and anything that you learn in that would be good for the whole, please feed that back to us, and we'll add that to our training. So, introduction to appointment making. What else should you do to be ready for the appointment making season? The 4th segment of your 2 CD set from the Lewis Center for Leadership is titled "It Always Seemed So Simple Before," the appointment making process. It was more simple when we were on the other side of it, maybe challenging at times. That's audio track number 5 on the first CD, and it's less than 10 minutes long, and it provides a helpful introduction to the appointment making process from the new DS perspective. So if you haven't already, we encourage you to review that. During the years that you've been a pastor, you've thought about, talked about, and if you're like most of us, you've done some armchair quarterbacking about how your bishop and cabinet have managed the appointment making process. Well, now it's different that you're at the cabinet table and you are intimately involved in this process of discernment and critical decision making. And it can be daunting because your role and responsibility in the process will have far-reaching consequences for a number of congregations, pastors, and pastors' families. Nearly no district superintendent I've ever known has taken that responsibility lightly. And don't be surprised if you feel overwhelmed at times as you take stock of the fact that key decisions made by the bishop and cabinet will hinge primarily on your input. But also take stock of the fact that most of the decisions are made in a collective process with your colleagues, and year after year, most of the appointments turn out well. And you will learn to lean on one another as you go through this around the cabinet table. And it's an edifying and enjoyable process when you see those matches made that really do bear great fruit.
As we've said before, prepare in prayer. Prayer can reveal to you some things that you might not think of right off the bat. And it's amazing what can be revealed to you when you pray for your colleagues around the table, but your pastors and your congregations by name. Really, this is part of getting to know your pastors and your congregations. And your clergy and laity within your district. And knowing the pastors, knowing the retired people, knowing the lay people who are certified lay ministers or certified lay speakers is just essential to this work of appointment making. In the midst of making appointments, there are also conferences, mine being one of them, where you also have some assigned supply. And so you really need to know those persons before you ask them to take part-time appointments within your district. There's no excuse for not knowing your churches or your pastors in this appointment process, because you literally have the lives of your pastors, the lives of the congregational members in your hands in this process. Know your colleagues around the table too, and be willing to enter into honest discussion around the table, not just about pastors and clergy in your district, but across the whole entire conference. Your conference superintendents first, and assigned to a particular district. And each, as I'm talking, know your cabinet's culture. Each cabinet is different, and each bishop is different in the appointment-making process. I worked on cabinet with 3 different bishops with 3 radically different appointment processes and systems. So you need to ask questions. Are there accepted but unspoken assumptions or rules about how the appointment process works in your cabinet? Are there assumptions or explicit priorities by which appointments are made? Which appointments get made first in the culture of your cabinet? Are there ground rules about the role of senior pastors in the appointment of associate pastors? What are assumptions or guidelines, if any, around how salary increases or reductions are made in the appointment process? How are appointment runs or patterns developed, and who maintains that master list of information? Are there unspoken assumptions or ground rules about communicating with other superintendents between cabinet sessions when everybody is at the table? Those are some pretty important things to think about. And if there are assumptions, or you feel there are assumptions that you aren't privy to in your new relationship with the cabinet, ask questions. And sometimes you'll be in a position to push the assumptions and help the whole cabinet get a new outlook on your appointment-making process.
Indeed. Generally, I always thought of preparing or doing the appointment making in these 3 movements. 1, to prepare thoroughly, to appoint decisively, and to follow up intentionally. The first we will talk about quite a bit in the next few minutes, and we'll also do the follow-up a little later. But I want to take a moment here to hover over the appoint decisively. One of the things that really caused the most problems when I was a member of the cabinet was when, after an appointment was fixed around the cabinet table, for a variety of reasons, the district superintendent then proceeded with a lack of confidence in making the appointment. It would often undermine the whole process. And appointments that could have really been very good ones didn't go off with the sort of momentum that they should have, because the way it was communicated was indecisive and mealy-mouthed or apologetic. Fortunately, that was the uncommon experience. More often than not, we left that table with a clear resolve that this was the best appointment, and that was needed for the next pastoral charge in this church, and then follow through with that. Just to be clear and decisive as you make your decisions, and follow through with confidence for the sake of all you're serving, both the pastors and the congregation.
Self-confidence and being a non-anxious presence in the midst of questions and discussion is one of the most essential qualities in the appointment-making process.
Next, we go to some of the nuts and bolts details of preparing. And a good place to start is with the Book of Discipline, paragraph 337, with the general provisions of the ministry and the itinerant system. Also, reviewing, if you haven't already and if you don't know it by heart, the section about full-time ministry being the norm and the boundaries of that understanding as they're laid out in the Book of Discipline. It's also important that you spend some time with paragraph 338.2 and related paragraphs because that is new to the discipline since 2012. Less than full-time appointments are more readily available, a more readily available option for appointment making. And it's a new tool in the church's toolbox, in the cabinet's toolbox, so to speak. And in the church's current state of flux, it can provide creative, fruitful options, but you have to be very careful to follow the outline for how you make a less than full-time appointment. So please pay some attention to those. I find that, and dropping back just a minute, I find that thinking about the appointment making process is sort of like painting a room. It's the prep work. It's selecting colors, moving furniture, cleaning and scraping walls, the detailed and tedious taping of all the corners and things like that that takes a long time. In comparison, the painting is quick and simple. It's like that with good appointment making. You do a lot of prep work to get yourself ready for it, but a lot of times the decisions come pretty quickly, and the act of appointing and fixing an appointment happens quickly. But it can usually happen well, and the outcome is good if you do all the prep work right. Bishop, do you want to take us through this one? Number 10.
Sure. Yeah. Interim appointments. We don't hear much about these in the United Methodist Church. I happen to think that intentional interim pastors are a great gift that we have not fully used as a resource in the United Methodist Church. I myself am a certified interim, trained interim minister, and I would encourage you to seek out some people in your conference for that training. There are some of the worst experiences in appointments are when somebody is an unintentional interim. What I mean by that is when someone has served a long pastorate in a particular setting and they leave because of retirement or some other issue. We really don't put a lot of thought and effort to think about what transition a congregation is going through emotionally, spiritually, psychologically within that transition. It would be so much more helpful to bring an intentional interim pastor in with set goals to help that congregation work through its grief and loss and truly be ready to accept a new pastor. This also happens not just with long-term pastorates, but when there's been a particular crisis in the midst of a pastoral appointment, where a pastor unexpectedly has to leave that appointment. There's lots of things that the congregations need to work through in those particular circumstances, and the use of intentional interim pastors can be such a gift to the congregation, to the district, to you as a superintendent, and to your whole conference. Just want to put that before you and encourage you to think and have some conversations about how intentional interim appointments might be useful to you and your cabinet in the appointment making system. Also, you want to pay attention to paragraph 339. That is the official definition of a pastor. It includes deacons and elders and persons who are licensed. This is particularly important when you pick up the issue of clergy compensation, where you have a situation where you have assigned supplies or lay persons who have taken on, say, minister of music or youth pastor. Those many times, unless those people share one of the status that are defined in 333, they are not viewed as official pastors, and that makes a huge difference when you're putting together a compensation package because there are tax implications for laity serving in those roles in assigned positions. So please pay attention to that, and we're going to address that a little later on too this morning. The Book of Discipline, the responsibilities, the duties of pastors, you need to read through those. and also the support for elders in full connection. That it's so helpful just to be familiar with those particular paragraphs when you think about the whole spectrum of the appointment making process.
We continue with consideration of deacons and the district superintendent's responsibility to appoint deacons. And on behalf of my deacon colleagues that I've talked to in recent months, many of whom feel like they have been misunderstood in the order of deacon and as a result sometimes misappointed, I want to emphasize how important it is for district superintendents to understand the order of deacon and the potential for truly creative missional appointments for deacons who have shown true effectiveness and fruitfulness. The example that I most readily think of, there are lots of them, but because of the proximity which I worked with her in the San Diego area, Reverend Mary Allman Boyd has a gift and a passion for evangelism, and she has been an incredibly fruitful and dynamic addition to the staff at First Church in San Diego, not only because of what she's brought to that congregation in leading them out of the church into the world as effective witnesses, but also as a leader in the district among the clergy with an emphasis on evangelism and cultivating our collective evangelistic efforts. So I think that's an example of how knowing the full pool of pastors available for you to work with in appointments can only benefit you and the larger church's mission in the long run. I also want to take a moment to discuss the district superintendent's responsibility for opportunities in relationship to clergy currently serving in other extension ministries. They're often overlooked, but hospice chaplains, hospital chaplains, military chaplains, and other persons serving in a variety of settings beyond the local church, college and seminary professors, for example, are your ongoing responsibility along with the clergy in the local churches of your district. So long as those persons have a charge conference within the bounds of your district, you have both pastoral and administrative supervisorial responsibilities over them. Yes, many of them will have a board or somebody that watches over their work and gives them an annual evaluation, but you too are responsible for knowing what that is and for keeping them in the connection. And I can think, again, of a couple of examples that I've worked with. One was a person who was working as the executive director of a nonprofit organization. Another was working as a hospice chaplain. And because I kept in touch with them and knew what they were doing in their extension ministries, I was able at times to deploy them to do certain work within the local churches of the district and also point pastors in the district of the local churches to these pastors as resources in the areas of expertise that they have, and it benefited both. So be aware of people in extension ministries and work with them to deploy them in ministry as well.
It's amazing how much our people on extension ministries feel affirmed when we recognize them and don't forget them in the midst of the appointment process and in the midst of just keeping in touch with our pastors on an ongoing basis. Also, go ahead.
Well, I just want to make sure, maybe we get ready to speak to this too, but make sure that you look at paragraphs 345 through 348 about all the other appointments, and go back and review paragraphs 426 through 428, or really 425 through 430, to review the whole Book of Disciplines rundown on district superintendents and their responsibilities for consultation in the appointment making process.
Yes, I would emphasize that. One of the things that I've asked my superintendents to do is in all their contacts throughout the year to take opportunities to share with the clergy or laity that they are with that this is a time, this is part of consultation. I'm here in the charge conference or meeting with the SPRC or in this training session. This is part of my consultation. I'm always taking in information as your superintendent that tells me about your congregation, that tells me about the pastor, and all that is part of the consultation process that goes into the appointment making situation.
These are three quick ones we want to make sure we bring to your attention. It's very important for you to know the system and the forms that are used in the appointment making system of your annual conference. And then along with that, know who your conference benefits officer is. We talked a lot about getting to know your cabinet colleagues, but there are other conference officers that you really need to know well and have a good working relationship with these persons. And key among them is the conference benefits officer. So make sure you know that person, you confer with them, know what they need from you, and let them help you. They can be wonderful, helpful partners in the work of administration of the DS. The oft-told tale of misfortune related to this particular area is that DSs sometimes fail to communicate and follow through thoroughly on appointment administrative details, and that creates a problem in a pastor's service record, perhaps, or not reporting accurate figures for salary. And that later has to be corrected all the way up sometimes to the Board of Pensions, and that equals a huge headache for everybody involved. Or not, like I said, not reporting salary figures accurately, which when discovered can mean that a conference has to go back and do back pay, or work out a way for a local church to do back pay. Suffice it to say, it's worth it to take the time up front to carefully make sure all those details are right before you submit those forms to avoid headaches later.
Absolutely. As the superintendent, I always double-checked my salary forms before I went in to introduce a new pastor to the SPRC to make sure that from the beginning I had it right. And one of the things you need to keep in mind, too, is that when there are appointments that are made where they had a clergy person, but now they are having a lay person serve in a pastoral role, don't assume that the treasurer knows the tax withholdings and all the other implications that come along with having a lay person as the pastoral lead in a situation. You will need to take the responsibility to walk through with the treasurers in those situations to make sure that they understand what they need to do in terms of those salary and tax implications. In the same way, laity serving in pastoral leads do not have the same access to the housing exclusion that clergy do. And again, it goes back to that definition of clergy in our Book of Discipline.
We're running just a little behind our expected time to keep us within an hour, so I'm just going to run through these quickly. And that is to say, make sure that you are aware of your conference's equitable compensation table and the policies related to that. In some conferences, that's a bigger deal than others, but all of you should know it just in case. Also, make sure that you're real clear about your conference's insurance policies and provisions, medical, dental, and in any other counseling for the pastor family, whatever your insurance policies cover, and housing policies. The bishop and I, before the webinar, were comparing notes about how different it is in West Virginia, where it's still a very definitely dominant parsonage system, and that if a pastor chooses not to live in the parsonage, he or she is not guaranteed a housing allowance, whereas the policy is very different in California Pacific, and I think I'm accurate in saying at least 50%, if not more, of the pastors either rent or own their own homes, which has some benefits when it works out well and you're moving toward retirement, but it can also be a real headache, like say in 2008 when the housing market went south, and that created a real headache for a lot of pastors. So either way, you need to know what the policies are so that you can counsel your pastors accordingly. We're going to move now to questions again, and Jason, you'll talk people through how to ask them, and if there are any that have come in.
We do have a couple of questions that have come in. How do other conferences handle equitable compensation for both equalizing salaries for pastors and key leadership appointments? I think you've talked about this a little bit, but if you could just summarize that.
Okay. Bishop?
There are some radically different practices that I'm aware of with equitable comp. Disciplinaire, According to discipline, equitable comp is to be used to bring people up to the minimum salary levels. And in many conferences, stick right with that, that disciplinary explanation for what equitable comp can be used for. I am aware that there are some other conferences that have set up specialized key leadership or perhaps ethnic ministry designations, but bottom line is that if there are limited fundings and resources, those funds that are in the equitable comp area are to be used to bring people up to the minimum salary levels. That is the first priority and the described use for equitable compensation funds. Myron, did you have any additional words on that from your experience?
Not a lot, just that I know that in California Pacific Conference, there was a time in which the equitable comp system allowed for a lot of really good certain ethnic minority ministries that would not have been able to get started without the support of the conference. But then that grew to a point where the compensation was being used for congregations in areas where it was hard to justify supporting a ministry there when there were other ministries that were self-sustaining in the neighborhood, and they weren't necessarily meeting a particular niche need, so to speak. But I know that's being closely looked at and reconsidered.
Yeah, it's supposed to be it's not use of equitable comp funds should be short term in order to give the congregation a help in fully supporting their pastor. Equitable comp is not designed to be used to prop up a situation long term. It's meant only to be used as a short term bridge to get a congregation back into supporting full-time ministry.
Exactly. That's the emphasis that we would use. I hope we've answered that question. If we have, great. If not, just send a note to Jason if you want more clarification or more specificity. We'll try to do that. Are there any other questions that have come in, Jason?
Yes, and this one ties in nicely with what was just mentioned. James says, our deacons in full connection have found themselves being squeezed out of the local church job market because of the salary, housing, pension, and insurance requirements. We have found that we've had to place several of our deacons in less than full-time positions. Any comments around that?
The one thing I want to emphasize, having had, like I said earlier, had some recent conversation with some deacon colleagues, is that most of them understand that that's sort of the nature of the beast with the order, but that it's more vulnerable than elders are in the current system to having their jobs eliminated. That being said, the Book of Discipline also has very clear requirements for notifying those persons in a set amount of time ahead, 90 days, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but look at the discipline about what the requirements are when you are going to eliminate an appointment for a deacon, and making sure that they are provided with all the support and resources for that transition that they are due according to the Book of Discipline. But it's a tough climate out there for deacons right now, and I think what you're witnessing in your conference is probably true in several others as well.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you've said, Myron. It is it's a very difficult environment for deacons now who would like to serve on staff with a congregation or with a group of congregations.
Right. Okay, we're going to hold other questions and come back to them later in the time together here. I'm going to move on to the next section where we're during the appointment making process. We've prepared, and now we are in it. We're sitting around the cabinet table come January and starting to talk about the move patterns. The main thing to remember is it's largely a matter of good communication, like a lot of our work is, and we recommend that you be deliberate and strategic in your communication both with your colleagues and especially with, when I say colleagues, with the other cabinet members, but especially when you're talking to staff relations committees and to individual clergy who may be up for a move. For example, you'll probably find, if you haven't already, that now that you're a DS, when you're with a group of clergy, you'll get pumped for information. And the temptation is to join the conversation and to, start telling stories and stuff. And we strongly discourage that. The simple rule is less is more. When you're talking with individual clergy, be careful not to disclose too much. Spend more time asking questions of them that will give you a better understanding of who they are and how they would be most effectively deployed. And when you're talking with clergy, it's usually not a good idea to discuss what churches are available. Again, they tend to hear more than that than you can promise. And it sets people up for disappointment. And it sets people up for at least accusing you of misleading them. Just less is more. When talking with pastor parish relations committee, it's almost never a good idea to discuss clergy who may be seeking a new appointment. You might know a lot of that, but keep it to yourself. Again, ask them questions that will help you better understand them and what sort of pastoral leadership would be best suited to help them pursue their mission and ministry. So by proactive and strategic, we mean that your communication should only enhance and further the process, not undermine it or complicate it.
Yeah, by sharing too much outside of the cabinet table, you can compromise the integrity of the cabinet's work and bring question as to the confidentiality or the trust in the confidentiality of conversations that happen around the cabinet table. When you're working on appointment making, don't fix problems by creating new ones. What I mean by that is that we all have those stellar pastors in our conference that could serve in a variety of places. Don't pull out a pastor too soon from an appointment where things are going really well to fix another appointment that's not going so well. More often than not, when that happens, the pastor has a hard time getting things going in the new congregation, and things in the previous appointment collapse. So don't fix problems by creating new ones, and avoid that temptation to pull good pastors out of appointments too early when things are really going well. Consider long and short-term outcomes. That what I've just said is a part of that. Don't just look at the moment, but look out to the future when you're thinking about appointments, not just locally, but as the conference. Do think of the moves ahead, 2 or 3 or 4 more moves ahead. For instance, if you've got somebody who you think might be a good cabinet member in the future, or you've got a particularly vital congregation that's going to come open in the next 2 years, you don't want to move the pastor that would be the perfect answer to those 2 appointment-making challenges this year and essentially make them unavailable to be considered in 2 years down the road. And again, don't react, respond to new developments. You do not need to be the anxious one in this process. You need to be the non-anxious presence. And if you've been in prayer, you will more appropriately respond to new developments instead of reacting in great anxiety.
I always found that appointment-making season developed a lot of momentum, and things started to happen at high speed, especially around April and May. And it was not uncommon for individual pastors or pastor parish relations committee chairs to call sometime during that period with an update, a specific item that related to a change in their circumstance that would be a critical update that has a bearing on the appointment-making process. And it's very important that you always keep those notes up to date in those files and reports up to date so that you can communicate that to the rest of the cabinet and not get stuck in a circumstance where you forget that, go on and make a decision, and then they're looking at you and say, I just called you and told you whatever they called and told you. And you have to go back and backtrack and work that out. So basically, keep your pastor and church profiles up to date and start doing that now. That's the charge conference season is really the time to do all that stuff as much as possible, so that you sit down at the table in December or January, whenever your cabinet begins the process, and you're ready to go. Also, perhaps this is obvious, but tell the truth. Be candid about pros and cons, especially in the first part of the process when you're talking with the other members of the cabinet. And then again, when you're talking to clergy and describing the congregations to which they've been appointed. A general rule of thumb that I always had, based both on the positive and negatives of my own experience in being appointed, was that if I knew something about a congregation, if I knew it was a hornet's nest, then I told the pastor, this is going to be a challenging appointment. I wanted them to go in with eyes wide open and their best chance of success. And I also would tell them, you'll certainly discover things that are either both good or challenging that I don't know about. And if I didn't tell you about it, that means I don't know about it. And so, full disclosure, it builds trust, and it helps pastors know what they are being expected to do in their new leadership role. And again, we say it again and again because it's that important. Be prayerful and collegial with your cabinet, and that helps to lead to good collaborative, cooperative work and good appointments. Now, we're moving into the part of the process where the decision has been made. We call that a designation. You sat around the table with the other members of the cabinet, and after prayerful discernment, you have said, this is the pastor that the bishop said, this is the pastor I want to go to that church. Now you start doing the work of setting up and doing the introduction. And one of the things you want to do is make sure that you give it its best chance to go right. Avoid all unnecessary surprises if you can. And the best way I found to do that is to follow a very clear checklist of what I needed to do. The order in which I needed to contact the pastor and the staff parish relations committee and say, an appointment has been made. We need to go ahead and set up a time to do the introduction. And this is where it really starts to happen quickly because, again, it's in a pattern. And you can't make one introduction before you've made the preceding introduction. And sometimes all that has to happen within 10 days. And so you have to tell the staff parish relations committee, I know you might only be able to get 4 people there tonight, but I need you to get those 4 people there tonight, and we're going to do the introduction. So you have to have some of those conversations, and that's why having a checklist in front of you to help you move through each of those appointments without dropping one of the balls is real important. There's 2 real clear things that happen again and again that can easily be avoided. And that's not to identify the pastor, the new pastor, to the outgoing pastor prior to the introduction. The exception to that would be, of course, depending on your ground rules in the annual comments, about senior pastors regarding associate pastors. We would often confer with the senior pastor in our conference about the incoming associate pastor before the introduction. And sometimes they would even have a meeting ahead of time. It just depends. But also, don't identify the new pastor to the staff parish relations committee before the introduction. Invariably, when I would call the staff parish chair to say, the bishop has made an appointment, I need you to pull your committee together in 3 nights, they would say, great, who is it? And I have to say, that will be made known at the meeting. That's the purpose of this, is to do an introduction. I'm not going to tell you who it is now. Sometimes somebody just couldn't resist, and when they did that, a lot of times there was enough information out on the street, sometimes accurate, sometimes not, that it undermined the appointment or created a huge mess that just didn't need to be dealt with. So just follow those basic rules and you'll save yourself a lot of headache.
And if you're doing bringing in a new pastor to meet with the SPRC, while you don't share the new pastor's name with the outgoing pastor, it is appropriate to say, to alert the pastor that you're bringing in a new pastor for an introduction, so there's not an awkward chance meeting in the hallway when you're doing that.
Yeah, I would always tell the outgoing pastor that there was going to be an introduction, that we would be on campus, and I'd need them not to be there. And that I would then call them as soon as the introduction was made and inform them so that they could then know what was going on.
Good point.
Okay, basically, think about how you'd want your appointment to be made, and do unto others as you would have done to you. That's just a good general ground rule to follow. And again, follow a carefully preset process, both for the preparation leading up to the introduction and then going through the introduction. We're going to pause in just a minute. I'm going to talk through some of the highlights of the introduction checklist that I've used. And I'll post it as an example along with a couple of other documents I'm going to refer to later in the Dropbox, and we'll email them to you as well within the next 24 hours. So here, I'm just going to pause for a minute, and I'm going to walk through some of the highlights of the introduction. For instance, I would always invite the members, the pastor and the members of the family, if he or she wanted to bring them along, felt comfortable about, to come to the meeting. And I'd also try to meet with them at least an hour or so off campus from the church ahead of time for coffee, either a morning introduction or dinner or something in the evening, depending on what that allows. But it just usually helped to set the tone and give me a chance to go over the process with them at the last minute, to double check and make sure that any lingering details were covered. I never, when it was under my control, I never went to one of those meetings without having already worked out all the details of the salary and compensation package, so that there were no surprises to either the staff parish or the pastor. That's the last thing you want surprises on an introductory meeting. I've seen several great introductions go south when they actually started talking money because they hadn't done it ahead of time. So get that done ahead of time. Basic things. Make sure the Staff Parish Relations Committee has name tags so that the pastor can know who he or she's talking to. And refreshments, basic hospitality. Help the staff parish, coach the Staff Parish Relations Committee on practicing hospitality. When I would get there to the campus, I would always make sure that the pastor wasn't there. I'd ask them to come to the campus 5 or 10 minutes after the hour to give all the staff parish members time to get in the room and for me to have a chance to debrief them about how the process was going to go. And then I would, thanks to the marvels of texting, I would usually text the pastor at that point and say, okay, we're ready for you. I'll meet you in the hallway or whatever. And before I did that, I always explained to the Staff Parish Relations Committee who they were going to be seeing that night. Don't do that. Don't leave either one of them in suspense until they're actually facing each other. It helps prepare the Staff Parish Committee to welcome their new pastor when they have, in that last few minutes, some sense of who's going to walk into the room. I've seen that be done for whatever reason when they kept it anonymous until the person was in the room. And that really sets everybody up for an awkward situation sometimes. So just I strongly advise against that. Introductions. I usually pray at the beginning of the meeting and then let the pastor introduce herself or himself, and then at a natural pausing point, let them stop and let the committee ask questions. Then usually 30 to 40 minutes into it, I'd invite them to step out, the pastor to step out, and I'd confer briefly with the staff parish to make sure that everything was okay. Usually it was just a matter of them wanting some more information. Go out in the hallway and do the same thing with the pastor. And I'd say about 98% of the appointments, everything went smoothly. There was no need to do any further negotiating or anything. Brought them back in the room and said, this is your opportunity to welcome your new pastor. We work out the details of the move and anything that's remaining. And then I usually invited the pastor to lead us in the closing prayer as their first pastoral act with the Staff Parish Relations Committee. And again, it's a relational bonding moment for them and very important. A lot of times they'll want to give the pastor a tour of the facility after that, and I would always just leave at that point and let them go ahead and visit with each other and get to know each other. So those are some highlights of the introduction process that I think are important to pay attention to. And again, we'll post this on the Dropbox or in the Dropbox and also send it to you directly via your email that we have for you to use.
And I would caution you in the introduction, do not vote Remember that consultation piece. All this is done in consultation. Even if you think everybody there will vote 100% to accept this pastor, what you've just done in allowing that to happen is you've set yourself up for trouble in the future. And SPRCs will not understand that this is an appointment process as opposed to a call process. So take every effort not to confuse the appointment process, the connectional process, with a congregational call process for pastoral leadership.
And let the people say amen. Okay, we're going to pause and take a couple more questions if there are others that have come in, Jason, or invite you to submit more if you'd like to.
Yep, we've had a couple that have come in. First question is, in disclosing, quote, open churches, end quote, do any conferences disclose who is retiring ahead of time?
Yeah, ours did. It usually was a sort of unavoidable thing to get out on the street. Most of the folks that are in the retirement category have a large group of friends that they've known for a long time. They talk about planning to retire, and it's very hard not to it's very hard to keep that information quiet. But there again, it's you don't have to be. That's just one of the things you fold into the reality that you're living with. Any other thing you'd say, Bishop? I mean, maybe there's some conferences that keep that silent. I don't know.
No, I think you're right. It's pretty hard. But even though that information gets out there, I have also had persons announce that they were going to retire and then change their mind. So that information is not always accurate.
Right. Good point. Any other questions?
If the new pastor is not available for a face-to-face meeting with the SPRC, is a speakerphone or conference call, Skype call appropriate for this, or would there be problems with that?
I can say from West Virginia, where the geography is great and it's several hours from one end to the other, that Skype, several of the superintendents recently have used Skype as part of a meeting tool, an introductory tool, and that seems to have worked okay in some of those situations. And so that is an option. I wouldn't personally, whenever you can get the personal introduction of a pastor to happen, I think that's kind of the best case scenario. But given geography and some other things, sometimes you have to look at other avenues of doing that introduction.
Yeah, I had two wonderful introductions that took place over webcam, and I, like the bishop, prefer the incarnational presence in the room. There's something about that you can't beat. But when logistics require another alternative, then sure, I've had good luck with doing a webcam introduction. Anybody else?
That's it for our questions for now.
Okay, great. We're going to play a little catch-up on these next couple of points of the topic to keep within our timing, or at least try to. Now we're after the appointment has been made. You've left and gone home to rest the rest of the righteous, and then the next morning you go to the office, and you want to make sure, first of all, I didn't put it in the slide here, but you want to make sure that you get all your paperwork in. We mentioned that earlier, that you want to do all the forms for a move authorization form is what we used in our conference to set in motion the conference office contacting the moving van company that we contracted with. All the salary and benefits information, you want to get all that stuff into conference officers, the conference benefit officer. Make sure you do all your paperwork right away and keep up to date on that.
Yeah, and don't save it up.
yeah, don't let it pile up. It's not good for anybody. And keep in touch with the pastor and, as appropriate, but less so, the staff parish chair in the time between introduction and move-in date. If possible, you want to call the pastor within 1 or 2 days before the first Sunday that they're in the pulpit. I always found that to be a meaningful point of touching base with the pastors, and sometimes pray with them prior to their first Sunday. And then also take the time in the weeks and months after July 1 to celebrate and integrate the new appointments into the life of the district. Help those people feel at home. And one of the resources that I've used for staff parish relations committees, maybe you all have seen it, I'll hold it up here. It's 50 ways to welcome your new senior or associate pastor, and it's a resource provided by the Lewis Center for Leadership. And
Great.
It's a really good 50-point checklist for staff parish relations committees to give them an idea of how to practice hospitality, because some of them just didn't receive that gift from the Holy Spirit, and they need a little help. So that's a good one. That's a good one to use.
And I would say after you've made a cross-cultural, cross-racial appointment, or if there's a congregation within your district that has received their first female pastor, those are particular situations where you need to follow up very soon after. You need to be intentional about following up in those situations numerous times throughout the first year of that appointment, so that pastors and or SPRCs don't feel like they're hanging out there on a limb by themselves. They need your support as a superintendent, particularly in those situations.
I'm really glad you mentioned that point. And going back to our common experience at Lake Junaluska, the intercultural competency workshop that we did is sort of a starting point that is a really good workshop. The extended version is a really good workshop for congregational leaders when there is going to be that sort of sharp cross-cultural or cross-racial appointment. And one of the things that more and more conferences are finding is that instead of putting them in place and hoping for the best, that it's far better to have this resources of the annual conference provided ahead of time to support congregations in that endeavor, and really help them succeed, help them prepare to make the transition to a new form of leadership that they've not experienced before. And that helps the pastor as well. Support all of them together to make it work. And they're good resources. If you want more on that, contact us. We have ways to help point you in the right direction.
I would make the same comments too for new seminary students that are in their first appointments after seminary in your particular district. They're used to a seminary community and support, and all of a sudden they find themselves in an appointment, which is what they've wanted, but it's a very different experience, and they need your support as their superintendent.
Mm-hmm. Along the same lines of thought, you want to schedule regular follow-up with the pastors in a 1 to 3 6-month time frame is what we recommend. Use what works for you and what's needed. And again, track it, because it's in those earlier months where it's still a higher than normal anxiety time of transition, and you can often catch and help prevent a lot of setbacks if you just stay on top of those appointments.
Absolutely.
Do the same things that we encourage you to do following your charge conference season are important after the appointment season. In fact, I usually found the appointment season to be far more stressful and time-consuming than the charge conference season. And so evaluate how it's gone and make notes of what you want to try to do better or differently the next year, and make sure you rest and take care of yourself along the way. Keep your resources intact for yourself. One last time for questions here in the latter part of the hour. Jason, have any others come in?
We're good for now, Myron.
Okay, very good. Thank you. Well, folks, this is wrapping it up for our 5 webinar series and our time together at Lake Junaluska in the orientation and training that's planned for now for 2013. And I want to thank you all for your participation in the whole process and the evaluations that you've given back to us. They've already helped us. We've already started to, whether you can tell it or not, we've already started to adjust based on what you have sent to us. And we really appreciate that. And to remain accountable in the process, we want to submit another evaluative request in about 6 months. because it's going to be at that point when you're really more deeply into your ministry that feedback from you will help us to answer some of the questions is how has this helped your ministry? What do you wish you had learned up to this point? And ask yourself the question, if I was leading the DS and DCM orientation and training next time, I would, and then complete the sentence. And then we'll have some other things in the evaluation form that will come to you. But you can keep those in mind as you move through the coming months, and keep notes, and feel free to offer us feedback on an ongoing basis. Watch for occasional updates. We are going to, as other things come up that we think will be helpful to you, especially in your first year, we will send them out via email directly to you. And we're also developing our website, and the chances are that we'll establish a Facebook page and a Twitter account to keep in touch with not just the new DSs, but with all the DSs that are currently active, and making that a central point for resource and community support for those serving in the superintendency. And now, Bishop, would you please give us a closing word?
Well, thank you very much for being with us. We will be keeping you in prayer as you complete your charge conference process. Keep the appointive process in mind as you go through the rest of those charge conferences, and may you be the light, the hope, the peace, and the love of Christ wherever you find yourselves.
Indeed. And may a Sabbath mood rest on your day, and find it good. Thank you, and God bless.
Thank you.